welcome back to JP's Budget Collecting. In our weekly look back at the hot comics from 6 months ago. This week we're looking back at the hot comics from June 17th, 2022, and I'm recording this on December 15th, 2022. You guys won't get to see this till the 17th, so I'm recording this a little earlier in the week than usual. As always, I give you those dates so you know when this information is actually relevant. And in this case, several of these books, there were changes and things that happened this week that potentially could have affected them. So, always want you guys to know when I'm kind of giving out when I got the information and that kind of thing. As always, we're looking back at the CBSI Hot Top 10 and the Comic Tom Key Collector Hottest Trending Comics of the Week. This week we got 17 books to look back at, technically. One of them's kind of more than one book, but we'll talk about that in a minute. 17 books between the two lists. And what we're doing here, as always, is looking back at these hot books that were moving in the market, that were going up in value, for whatever reason, usually some sort of news, and seeing how they performed on the 6 months following that news, and whether they were something you needed to pursue then, or if FOMO would have been better to avoid and just be patient and come back to. If you've been following along, you know that in general, especially in 2022, it's been patience, patience, patience. So, without further ado, let's dig into these 17 books. First up, once again, for like the fourth time in 2022, we're talking about a book or group of books that hit the list because of the passing of an artist or a comic book great. We've done this for Neil Adams. We've done this for George Perez. This time it was for Tim Sale. Basically, right after his passing, Batman The Long Halloween was put on the list, and they were talking about the full set. So sets of 1 through 13 were going for over $300 back then, or $300 plus back then, as people were trying to collect kind of his most famous series and trying to get the whole set. So that's what was they put on the list to kind of what was people were going after in honor of Tim Sale. Now it's $150 to $300 still for a set. A lot of, basically condition kind of thing, but definitely down, and then I'll be back. And if you were patient, you could have done a little better on these Long Halloween books. Very typical for when an artist or famous person passes in their memorabilia. Usually there's a spike, and then it usually comes back down. Sometimes it goes back to where it was. Sometimes it just goes back to somewhere in between. In this case, we weren't talking about signature stuff, so it pretty much went back to what it was before. Next, we have Spawn, number 38. This hit the list. This is the first appearance of Cygor, and this list hit the list because McFarlane said we're getting a adult cartoon featuring this character and some other McFarlane toy characters that aren't even in the comics. Back then, that caused this book to jump up to a $15 to $30 book. A 9.8 hit $250. Shockingly, with a McFarlane-backed project, we haven't heard any news since, and there hasn't been any movement. And this is now a $5 to $20 book. 9.8, 90 to 170. So this is definitely an I'll be back, borderline trap on some of this. But most of the sales are raw side, and there is definitely some overlap on that lower end of the previous value. So we call that an I'll be back for sure. But yeah, sort of what you should have anytime you hear McFarlane in some sort of option or project is believe it when you see it. All right, next we have two books related to the return of The Boys. First up is The Boys number 1. Obviously, season 3 was kicking off, and that caused this book to jump back up. 9.8s were back up to around $425 plus back then. Now, raw copies on this are $75 to $125, but 9.8s are still $350 to $600, so you can get a 9.8 for a little less than values back then, but they're also still going for more. So I kind of put this as steady and worth it. It's kind of still in that same range that it's been. I would say as long as the series is going and staying as popular as it is, this book is going to stay in these kind of ranges. You might be able to find a deal occasionally, but it's probably going to be pretty worth it. But once it ends, then you're probably going to look at a downward trend on this book. So it's just up to you whether or not you can wait that long till the show comes and goes before, like permanently, before trying to get on this to try to get a truly better deal. Next, we have The Boys number 7. This is the first appearance of the legend, who's kind of the Stan Lee of the Boys universe. And also the first appearance of the Paybacks. So there is 2, but the Legend was the one coming to season 3 of The Boys. Back then, raw copies jumped up to 10 whole bucks. 9.8 was 75 to 125. No recent 9.8 sales, but we're still kind of a $5 to $15 book. So on the raw side, it's still basically steady. I put it as an I'll be back because you can't get it for under 10. All right, with that, we still got ops and TV stuff coming up. And our next one is the free comic book day, One Punch Man, My Hero Academia. But this is all about One Punch Man in this case. This is the first appearance of these characters, or One Punch Man, in American comics. And actually the only appearance to date in truly American comics. And this had to do with movie news, that we were maybe getting a One Punch Man movie, excuse me. Back then, raw copies were up to $50 on this. The 9.8s were hitting $450 to $500. Remember, this was a free comic book day book back from 2016. Now it's a $30 to $60 book. 9.8, $3 to $450, so down a little bit of an I'll be back. I will say, if you've never dived into Japanese manga or anime, One Punch is a pretty decent place to sit if you're used to superhero type stories. It kind of turns a lot of the superhero tropes on its head. It's pretty funny. It's pretty well done. So yeah, it was always meant to be kind of a take on superheroes. And this is one I would, you can find it online and read it basically for free. Yeah, this is one I would definitely recommend if you're interested in that kind of stuff. Reminder, you have to read the other way. But other than that, it's pretty good. Next, we have Duke Nukem, Glorious Bastard, #1, from 2011, and this was actually the first appearance of Duke Nukem in comics. Surprising it didn't come to 2011, since he was kind of a thing in the 90s, and not really since, I don't feel like, even in the gaming world, but maybe I missed it. But supposedly there's a movie in development for Duke Nukem. Wouldn't have high hopes for this one, given the track record of these types of games being turned into movies. But yeah, back then, raw copies were jumping to 15. Now it's a $5 to $15 book. It was only up to 15, so it wasn't that far to fall. But yeah, we'd call this definitely an I'll be back. Next, we're going to move into our only cover this week, which, if you've been following the list lately, is pretty rare not to be... have 5 or 6 covers in a week. But this is the only one, and it wasn't even a new one. This is Green Lantern number 55. The Doug Mankey 1 in 25 from 2010. This is Lobo with the lantern rings, which the main man with the lantern rings would not be a good thing for anyone. So this is a pretty popular, fairly hard to find cover. Raw copies back then were going for $200. And they're still basically $2 to $225. 9.8 recently went for $550. Only sale recently of a 9.8. This is definitely steady and worth it. It's sitting right there. Maybe slowly creeping up a little bit. Definitely an in-demand cover when it comes up, for sure. So next, we're going to move into Comic Buzz, which is our only Comic Buzz book this week, is Grimm #1, the 3rd print. So they kept kind of allocating these. So that there was still demand, so they allocated the first print, so not everybody got one that really wanted one, and then they allocated the second print, so still people weren't necessarily getting it. So trying to create that demand for this book. I don't know, I haven't really heard anything about the series since the first couple of issues, so let me know in the comments if it's actually been good. This is not one I really gave a shot to. I just kind of waited to hear what people thought, and I haven't heard much, so I am curious. But back then, 3rd print was going from $15 to $20 at release. Now it's a $5 to $20 book. 9.8, so only go for like $30 to $40 plus shipping. So yeah, this is definitely a down, and I'll be back overall. And yeah, if you can steal a 9.8 for $30 plus shipping, then that would be the way to go if you really wanted this. If you were trying to collect it for like value long term, if Grimm gets turned into something. But like I said, curious to see if people are enjoying this series or not, because I don't feel like I've heard anybody talk about it after the initial buzz. So with that, we're going to move into movie stuff on the Marvel side. But first up, it's the Sony side of Marvel, the Sony Spider stuff. And it has to do with Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the animated Sony Spider stuff. Back then, we got our little teaser trailer and caused several books to jump. The next 4 books are all related to that teaser trailer. Interestingly enough, on Tuesday, we got the new first full trailer for Across the Spider-Verse. So yeah, I was curious to see what these books did. But 3 of the books, first up, are all related to the same character that didn't appear in this trailer, the most recent trailer. So they didn't really react much, at least not as of last night, Wednesday night, when I was looking up values. First up, we have Spectacular Spider-Man number 100, the third appearance of the Spot. Back then, it was a $10 book, because obviously the Spot appears to be the villain of this, and he was featured in that first teaser. He was not featured in the most recent trailer. But $10 for a raw copy back then. 9.8 hit 128. Now it's still a $5 to $15 book for a raw copy. No recent 9.8 sales. So kind of a steady I'll be back, but, you know, because you can still definitely do, hasn't really jumped. It was still a $5 to $10 book. Still is. So yeah, it's just kind of an I'll be back. You can get it whenever. So far, hasn't really moved much. Next, we have Spectacular Spider-Man number 99, the second appearance and first cover appearance of the Spot. And back then, that was all the way up to a $20 book on average. 9.8 hit 269. Now it's a $15 to $30 book. 9.8, 250. With most of the sales, 250, 300, but there was a sale up toward 500. So yeah, we put steady and worth it on this. I feel like that 500 is a bit of an outlier, but yeah, steady and worth it. It's actually kind of worth a little bit more. It is kind of a cool cover, I will say that. And then next we have Spectacular Spider-Man number 98, first appearance of the Spot. That was a $20 to $60 book back then. 9.8, 460 to 600. It's now kind of a $15 to $50 book. 9.8, 3 to 400 now. So this has definitely turned into a down, and I'll be back. Interestingly, but it was went a little higher initially, so it has fallen back a little bit, whereas those others didn't go as high, and they've kind of stayed a little steadier. But again, we didn't get the Spot in this most recent trailer, so we'll see when the movie actually comes out next spring, what happens with these books at that point. Last book related to that is Ultimate Fallout 4, the first appearance of Miles Morales. This was interesting. This book had been like sky high, particularly in 21. It started coming back down a little bit in spring of 22, but jumped back up with that initial teaser trailer. Raw copies were averaging 680. 9.8 was back up to 3650. It dropped down around 3,000 or below, or in the twos a little bit after being up around 4 during 21. But now 450 to 700. So raw copies are still in the same range, but 9.8s, 1,900 to 2,200. Again, I double checked last night. So I looked at it Tuesday night, and then I also looked at it last night to see how it was responding to the trailer. Really wasn't any 9.8 sales on eBay at that point. So it really hadn't moved. It was still that 19 to 2,200. We'll see if it eventually moves. I would think it's going to move again. But there's also got to be some saturation at this point on Miles. That most people that really want it probably have it. I'm sure there's some people that don't, that are trying to wait for a deal. Now's maybe not a bad time if it doesn't jump right now. Now's not a bad time to maybe get on it at these values probably. So yeah, it actually turned into a bit of a trap on the 9.8 side. Next, we're going to move into actual MCU-related stuff, and first up, we have Ms. Marvel number 13, the first appearance of Cameron. He was a character that did show up in the show, and did play a fairly important role. Back then, raw copies were going for 15 to 20 as the show was coming out, with his first appearance, like on the show, I should say, and his first appearance comic jumped up a little bit. Now it's still a $5 to $20 book. 9.8, that will only cost you 30. The two sales, I think there was only 2 sales there, were both around 30 plus shipping. So yeah, this is a down, and I'll be back for sure. Looking forward to more Ms. Marvel. I really enjoyed that show. I know there's a little bit of mixed reviews, but I think for the most part people liked it. I'm looking forward to more. So next we got Wonder Man number 1 from 1991. This is the first ongoing solo series. So there was a solo title before this that was a one-shot. This is the ongoing. Didn't happen to 91. Back then, 9.8, though, jumped all the way up to 125. With rumors we were going to get a Wonder Man show. We now know that is a fact. And the book is a $5 to $15 book now, though, for raw copies. 9.8, 40 to 100. So this still turned into a trap. Yeah, most of those 9.8 sales are like 60, 70, which is about half of what it was back then. Yeah, so this one definitely turned into a bit of a trap, even with news. And I think we actually got casting, but I'm not 100% sure on that now. I feel like I heard casting, but maybe I'm thinking of somebody else. Next, we have Avengers number 9, the first appearance of Wonder Man. Obviously, a much bigger book. Back then, we were hitting all-time highs at a couple different grades. 8.0 went for 1,900. 5.5 went for 625. Now, an 8.0 costs you 13. 5.5s are running 4,800 last couple sales. Raw copies will cost you 125, 300 depending on condition. Obviously, a really high grade would go higher, but the typical conditions you can actually find online, or you're looking at 125, 300. So definitely an I'll be back on this one. Not a trap, although borderline getting to that stage. But yeah, definitely an I'll be back, even with additional news. Just the way the market has went in 22, everything is just down and a little more affordable at the moment. Next, we have Thunderbolts number 1 from 1997. This is their first titled series, the first Thunderbolt series. Obviously, we were getting rumors of the movie back then. That there was a director and all that kind of stuff. We now have confirmation. We now know which characters are going to be a part of it for the most part. So yeah, but back then it was the raw copies were $30 on this. 9.8 hit 270. Now it's a $15 to $35 book for a raw copy. 9.8 1 to 225. Pretty wide range on the 9.8s, although most are in the 100s. So yeah, you could call the 9.8s a trap. The raw copy's more of an I'll be back. But definitely down on this one, and yeah. So even with, again, additional news, has not been able to sustain this book. Even though we've had additional news in the 6 months, hasn't sustained the values here from that initial jump when we've got first news about the confirmation that we were going to get Thunderbolts. Next, we have Incredible Hulk number 449. Second week in a row this was on the list. And yeah, this is the first appearance of the Thunderbolts. Back then, raw copies were up to 150. 9.8 hit 815. Reminder, last week when we talked about it, it was because 9.8s were hitting 650 to 700. Now, raw costs you 50 to 150. 9.8, 450 to 650. So, yeah, this has also turned into I'll be back, borderline trap on this one. Yeah, it's backed up quite a bit from those values that we were getting back in the spring. So with that is our complete list. A lot of stuff dropped. Nothing dropped. No super dramatic drops. Like last week we had like 4 dumpster fires. This week we didn't have any, but definitely still the trend is down, 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 with just a few books kind of hanging in there steady. I want to thank you guys for watching, and we will catch you next time.